Mic check here, Tanya. Can you hear me? Everything's clear? You're on mute, Tanya.
Yes. Yes, I can hear you.
All right, I'm gonna go to mute. If you can, oh, let me see. Samuel, can you say something so we can hear you okay?
Yeah, I hear you well. Do you hear me well?
Yep, I got you. Ira, how about you? You okay over there?
Sound good to me. Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, we're good. So hopefully we won't have that that issue we had earlier. If we do, we'll just kind of work through it. All right, so Tanya, whenever you're ready to start, we can get back in.
Okay, yeah, go ahead and get started. So our next panel, Mr. Ira and Pardini, go ahead and take it away.
All right, had a slight delay there, Tanya, but think we're okay now. All right, well, welcome back. For those who, in our first session, it turned out very well, I think. And this is our second session. I know we may have some people who chimed in just for the second session to hear from Brother Ira and Brother Sam. My name is James Stancil. I'm the Chief Program Officer for Intellect U Well, and this is our Intellect U Well Journeys event, African Diaspora. And for this session, we're gonna hear from Ira Dworkin from Texas A&M University and Sam Pardini from Elon University. And gentlemen, if you don't mind, just a really quick, brief introduction, just for folk who maybe weren't here from the beginning, and the book that you're going to be discussing today, and then we'll kind of get into our main moderation of the panel. All right, so we'll start with you, Ira.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, as James mentioned, I teach at Texas A&M University, and I've been there for 7 years. Prior to that, I taught at the American University of Cairo in Egypt, and that's that's a sort of quick version of who I am. This is the book Congo Love Song that I'll be discussing a little bit further in the next hour with everyone.
Brother Sam?
Yes. So, yeah, I teach at Elon, Carolina, the Piedmont region, and I'm an associate professor here in the Department of World Languages and Cultures, and I'm coordinator of the American Studies program, and I've been here 14 years now, and I'll be talking about my book, The Name of the Mother, which is this one next year, and next hour, sorry. And,
that one right there, right?
Yep. So, yes, that's. Excuse me.
Okay, I think I was briefly muted. So, I know, Ira, you told us a little bit about your background, teaching at in Cairo and all those things. But can you just tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write this book, and kind of what motivated you to become a scholar and an academic as well? And then Sam, I ask you the same question after Ira finishes.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. The sort of broader question I think about becoming an academic. I was the first person and the first person in my family to go to college. But I was growing up. I was born in the Philadelphia suburbs. This is in the 1980s, and there was a lot of public debate and work really by Black educators quite publicly about the kinds of curriculum that we were seeing both in sort of public schools, whether it was the Philadelphia public schools or suburban districts like mine or in universities, a lot of the kind of what we now think about as the kind of culture wars, which I guess one might argue are kind of remain ongoing more than 30 years later. But sort of seeing a lot of that work kind of, was the moment when I started to kind of think and read quite seriously. And so I think like a lot of folks, I, picked up, as a young teenager, the autobiography of Malcolm X. I read the poetry of Amiri Baraka, which I was able to kind of quickly appreciate as something distinct from what was happening, or the kinds of things that I was learning in my kind of majority white suburban, high school. In terms of this book, I mean, I think coming out of this book, I think if I were to track the particular genesis, I mean, there's a lot of interesting kind of questions of, as you frame this conversation about the African diaspora. But one thing, very specific thing I would point out would be John Hope Franklin's fantastic biography of George Washington Williams. And when I read that, at the end of that book, Franklin, who worked on that book for, close to 50 years, was something he began when he was quite young and sort of continued to work on it for decades. And at the end of that, he appended 3 pamphlets that the historian George Washington Williams had written about the Congo during his time there. So this is in 1890 and 1891. And that was, those documents were an incredible starting point because those documents, along with the kind of reading that I had been doing in Black newspapers and magazines from the 19th and early 20th century, really challenged a lot of, I think, the presumptions that Americans, and particularly white Americans, have about ignorance about Africa and the idea that this is somehow preordained. And so I think the sort of mistake is to kind of superimpose our kind of own contemporary forms of ignorance, and again, speaking of Americans and specifically white Americans, on earlier generations. And that's actually, I think, when you look at these newspapers and look at what sort of the work that writers and activists and educators and intellectuals were doing during that time, that's not actually, I think, a historically accurate. There was lots of forms of ongoing engagement around a number of different sites, and people were deeply interested and familiar with modern African politics. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And just as one example, I mean, the title of my book, CONGO LOVE SONG, comes from a song that was written by the great writer and activist James Weldon Johnson, who's probably best known as the author of the songwriter of Lift Every Voice and Sing, the national anthem. And Congo Love Song was another of his popular songs. It was a popular kind of, generally considered kind of vaudeville song. That was not really understood, or sort of is not typically understood as a kind of political, as a political kind of form of culture, I guess, is how I would sort of describe the sort of common understanding of it. This popular vaudeville engages with what we might call kind of primitivist sort of stereotypes. But my sort of sense of that song is that when you understand who was performing it, who was listening to it, where it was circulating at this time, when there was an Black-led movement in the United States for reform in the Congo, that song, the meaning of that song really transforms itself. And again, for me, I think this is really a kind of, a striking moment and a really good example of the ways that we can see forms of political engagement within kind of unexpected parts of the sort of cultural, the cultural sphere.
Absolutely, Ira. And, Ira came and talked with us with Intellect U Well at Bradley's bookstore, and we got into some of these topics there as well. But I know I definitely want to make the connection with Hampton University and Texas Southern University. I remember we talked a little bit about that, and and I know we're a Houston-based organization, and one of our board members is a Hampton alum, so I'm sure he's probably wants to mention some things there as well. And I forgot Texas Southern University, Brother Tony as well, Texas Southern University alum we have on our board. So we'll get into those things as well, because people don't really think about the scholarship in the Black community at historically Black colleges and universities during that time. And I think with your work, Ira, you did a really great job at showing people and explaining that. And that cover, your book cover there. Do you have a copy of your book anywhere handy?
Of course.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, so we'll get into that piece as well. But I want to give Brother Sam a chance to talk about his work as well here, and just kind of, a little bit about you, why you were interested in this work, and kind of how we got to where we are. And I know, Sam, we talked about Miracle at St. Anna. That's one of our favorite movies. So please definitely mention that connection. That's like my favorite Spike Lee. Well, not my very favorite. One of my top 5 Spike Lee movies.
So, like Ira, I also was the first in my family to go to college, though not in the United States, but in Italy, where I was born and grew up until I was my early 20s. And I think like many people who decide to go into academia is because they find an inspiring teacher. And in undergraduate, I found no one, but at least three very inspiring teachers. And they were, all my degrees are in comparative literature. And these teachers were comparatists, but they also have a deep interest in United States, in American literature and history. One of them, history. So, it was sort of like, kind of like the next step after I graduated from the University of Pisa to try to go to the United States. And, talk about luck, I ended up going to the State University of New York at Buffalo. And I had no idea that Leslie Fiedler was there, the great critic of American literature, mostly known for his masterpiece called Love and Death in the American Novel. And Fiedler was basically responsible for bringing race and gender into the conversation after World War II in the United States with a famous essay called Come Back to the Raft Again, Honey, that was published in 1948 in the Partisan Review that upset a lot of people, apparently, and including one young fellow called Ralph Ellison, who thought, he wrote a friend of his, Hal Murray, said, not bad, this Fiedler guy. So I went to Buffalo and I ended up studying with him. Now, my interest is in studying research is actually not in race or ethnicity, but in 20th century modernity. So the way I approach race and ethnicity and class is, for me, a way, through the lenses of 20th century modernity. So the way the book came about, and I actually didn't study the stuff that is in the book until after I completed my PhD. My thesis PhD was totally about different area. But I was teaching this stuff. I started teaching Italian American Studies as an undergraduate. And the more I taught, and then I got hired after my PhD. I ended up first at Vanderbilt for 2 years and then at Elon, and I kept teaching everywhere I went this Italian American Studies. The more I read, the more I found this presence of African American people and a blackness there. So when I started thinking about the book, I also said, well, there's really no point in just doing a book about Italian Americans and looking at blackness in Italian Americans if I don't look at African American texts and culture, and if there is any presence whatsoever of Italian and Italian Americans in there. And little did I know, there's a whole lot, and a lot more than I put in the book. But obviously, you gotta, narrow down things, otherwise you ended up, not finishing the book. And so I had to narrow it down. But the more I look into stuff, and the more I found an Italian presence in African American text. And the interesting part to me was that these were, in some fashion, key texts at different moments in different times, where it was the beginning of the 20th century, establishment of Jim Crow, when immigration is shut down from Europe and the Mediterranean in the early 20s, during the Great Depression, right after World War II, and then even into the early 60s before, the civil rights movement. And I think people don't realize, but the civil rights movement happened at the same time when the request to immigration reform occurs in the 50s. And then, at JFK obviously opens up again, right? So these things are never disentangled. The history of ethnicity in the United States in the 20th century is entirely entangled with the history of race in the 20th. And of course, the same thing happens with labor history, because after the Civil War, labor history is essentially race and ethnic history. Who works in the coal mines? Blacks, Italians, Slavic, Jews, Eastern European Jews. Who works, in the steel mills? Same people. Who works in the textile industries? The ethnic young girl and ladies. Soon is going to be the anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in New York City, for example, a week from now. So, I ended up finding a ton of material, and I tried to put it all back together and look at, how the African American presence was impacting Italian American identity through the text and the performances, because I look at music as well. And likewise, what were African Americans writers? And we're talking about essential writers. I mean, Ira was talking about James Weldon Johnson. I mean, the autobiography on ex-colored man is the way I start. Booker T. Washington. Yeah, Booker T. Washington, The Man Farthest Down, and then there's, Willard Motley and
you mentioned Ralph Ellison.
Right. Yeah. And then there's a fantastic book from the early Renaissance. Between the session before, somebody was talking about passing. I think it was Carr talking about passing in the early Renaissance. And there's a phenomenal novel that was published posthumous by Richard Nugent called Gentleman Jigger, which is all about essentially Italian gangster from the eyes on an African American writer. So I stopped there for the moment.
Yeah.
I put a lot of meat on the grill, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you put some big 20-pound steaks up there, Sam.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to slow you down a little bit. As you can tell, Sam is very passionate about his work. He's an excellent scholar, in Italian studies. His book is an award winner. And he could talk with you all day about some of these issues. And we talk about Capone and Noriega, Scarface, and all the rappers and stuff that use the Italian names and the connections and those kind of things. And he and I go back and forth, about a lot of these these issues, all the time. And so and again, Sam, I'm just going to put it out here for you now. If you all want to talk with Sam about some of these issues, Sam, you don't mind if they email you and contact you, right?
No, absolutely, quite the contrary.
Yeah.
Just Google my name or go to the Elon University. There's only one last name like mine. So there are many in the South with this last name.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you gave us a little taste there about what what we can expect in in your book. Of course, my favorite topic, miracle at Saint Anna, the black soldiers in World War II. And you have a personal family connection to that as well, if I recall, right, Sam?
Yes. I grew up 20 minutes from where that massacre happened, and actually my one of the survivors was the principal of my middle school, and actually I think I told you my father was liberated from the Nazis by the Buffalo Soldiers, and I actually have a relative of mine is a black man.
Absolutely.
Because
we'll come back to that. I want to give Ira a chance to kind of get into stuff a little bit, but keep that in mind. Tab that, because I think that's going to be an interesting topic. Because I know when you and I talked about it, really, fascinated me. So Ira, back to you over here. Can you kind of give us a brief summary of what readers should expect, when they pick up your book there, and also maybe just like I asked the gentleman in the first session, how long did it take? What was the entire length of your research efforts or your scholarship?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the whole project was from dissertation to book was 15 years pretty much. And a lot of that time was spent doing research and traveling. And a lot of it was spent in archives, I think, as you mentioned too, particularly archives of HBCUs, particularly Hampton, which has a sort of central role in this book. Spending a lot of time reading archives of Black newspapers and magazines, Presbyterian Historical Society for Religious Documents, colonial archives in Belgium, archives in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also part of that process over those years is the really important kinds of conversations that I've been able to have in collaborations with colleagues, across all of these sites, right? So audiences, colleagues, students, teachers, community members in the Congo, in Belgium in particular, and in the United States as well. I think when readers pick up the book, I think a beginning point is George Washington Williams, who I mentioned, and just to kind of bring these pieces together, he wrote these pamphlets on the Congo when he was there, and never returned to the United States afterwards. He died in England on his way back. It seemed that he had sort of settled down there, but it was quite soon. It was within a year, really, of his trip to the Congo. The thing about the thing about George Washington Williams, before he traveled to the Congo, the thing I found out is that the first place he went after he had gotten a kind of commission from King Leopold to recruit African Americans, the first place he went was to Hampton. And so he went to Hampton to recruit students. Several signed up. None of them actually ever went, because Samuel Chapman Armstrong, who was the founding principal of Hampton, kind of blocked that from happening. But this is, just to give a sense of the sort of chronology, this is material that begins, the efforts of someone like Williams actually begins before the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, which was responsible really for the European partitioning of Africa into sort of different colonial dominions. The Hampton connection, and I mentioned sort of mistakenly, actually. So William Henry Shepherd, who was the figure on the cover of the book, is an African-American missionary who had been Booker T. Washington's student at Hampton. So this was Washington when he was teaching at Hampton prior to becoming the founding principal of Tuskegee. And he went as a Presbyterian missionary, and is not a particularly well-known figure today, but he's someone who was quite well-known. Certainly at the time was popular as a speaker through, at a number of HBCU campuses. He recruited sort of really remarkable generation of Black missionaries to the Congo in the first 2 decades. So we're thinking about 1890 to 1910. One of the things that I think my book does, and this sort of I think ties together a number of things that I think we've been talking about, is that someone like William Shepherd. So William Shepherd collected art when he was in the Congo. There's a lot of evidence that sort of his, I guess we think about, the sort of great scenes from Black Panther about sort of the African art objects and sort of how they end up in European museums. One of the things we have from Shepherd is we have a slightly different history of how those items came into his collection. So for instance, some of the most famous items of Congolese art are things that he observed and that were sort of stolen by European sort of collectors, also known as thieves, a decade later. But this collection became the foundation. So part of what I think is really remarkable is this collection is one that he sold to Hampton Institute then over the period of about a decade. And this became the foundation for the art department at Hampton University, which was established in the early 1940s when Hampton hired Victor Lowenfeld, who was a Jewish Austrian refugee who came to the United States. And he was hired as a psychology professor, but he had been the director of an African art museum in Vienna. He arrives there, and then he sort of finds this collection that hadn't been on display because a lot of Hampton had been basically taken over by the U.S. military during World War II. And so a lot of this art material was in this kind of remarkable collection was in storage at this point. So Lowenfeld finds it, and this is the moment when there's a really incredible generation of African-American artists who are coming to Hampton, both as students and teachers. So Elizabeth Catlett and Charles White are teaching there then. The students are the great artist and historian Samuele Lewis, and sort of most pertinent to kind of the story that I think we're going to talk about today, John Biggers, who was the founding chair of the art department at Texas Southern University. in I think in the early 1950s, and is responsible for an enormous number of incredible murals that sort of are all throughout sort of Houston and the Houston area. But John Biggers talks about being introduced by his mentor, Victor Lowenfeld, to the Congolese art that we see there, right? And so this is one of the avenues that we can kind of understand that he sort of comes to understand and appreciate and recognize the history of Shepard's collection. Now, Shepard had passed away in 1927, right? So he never met John Biggers, but John Biggers, through Lowenfeld and through others in Hampton, through this kind of network, really understood and appreciated that history. So that's one of the sort of things, and I was able to really reproduce a lot of Biggers' work and some of the Congolese art in the book as well. If I may, just one other thing that maybe I'll mention, and maybe we can circle back to this if there's time.
Sure.
There's a number. Is that?
No, I said sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, the story includes people like William Henry Shepard, who might not be well known, but also people who are well known. I mentioned Booker T. Washington, and Samuel mentioned Booker T. Washington as well. Booker T. Washington was the vice president of the Congo Reform Association in the early 20th century, along with Mark Twain, and wrote about the Congo. The other thing that I sort of like to remind folks, and this is kind of where the book ends, just to kind of give the full arc, since I talked about some of the earlier material, is Malcolm X. So one of Malcolm X's sort of most famous statements, as I think folks are probably familiar with, was after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, when he was asked questions. This was, I think, December 1st, 1963. It's his first public forum. And he said that the assassination of John F. Kennedy was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. This is an incredibly famous statement by Malcolm X. It was something that was controversial and sort of heightened the tension between him and Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, and basically sort of led to sort of events that led to his expulsion from the Nation of Islam. The reason I bring that up in that context is that actually Malcolm's full remarks about chickens coming home to roost included an analysis of the U.S. role in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo in 1961, right? So he says it's an example of what the U.S. did to Patrice Lumumba. And that part of the story is left out, right? But at this really kind of formative, what's broadly recognized and understood as a really central moment in this sort of modern history of Black politics and the history of Black nationalism, and then within kind of Malcolm's own career, sort of that formulation is really part of this really important and sophisticated and deep political analysis, right, of the ways that the U.S. was deeply implicated in the ongoing sort of colonial and neo-colonial violence in the Congo, including the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. And it serves as a reminder as well, I think, hopefully for all of us, that there's a kind of ultimately a real inseparability of the local and global when we're sort of talking about these political forms.
Absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned that, Ira, because I had just mentioned it to my wife. She was watching the Who Shot Malcolm X documentary on Netflix. And when you mentioned she could come home, I mentioned to her specifically that was in reference to some of the stuff the CIA was doing in other countries, Carlos Allende and, and South America. Luis might still be on here, as well as Patrice over there in Congo. All right, good stuff. Sam, you ready? You can tell us about Miracle at St. Anna, and Ira was talking about those connections between the Congo and the United States. Yeah, tell us more about what you found in your research about the African Americans and the Italian experience. And I love the cover of your book, so please mention that fellow out there too. And I don't know if you've ever figured out who he is since we first talked, but I love when you talk about that as well. Hold on, Sam. You're coming in hot. Here you go now.
Okay.
Before the mute was over.
So the Miracle at Sant'Anna, briefly, because I don't talk about it in the book, but it's Sant'Anna is a small town in Tuscany, near the coast, Tuscany, and during World War II, it was unfortunately the site of one of the biggest massacres, Nazi massacre. And basically, it's a small, it's not a small town, it's a village actually up in the mountain, and about like 100 people lived there, and they were all rounded up by the Nazis and executed inside the church. And there were only a couple of kids, I think 2 children, who survived from this massacre. And the reason that the massacre was because the partisans were active in supporting the Anglo-Allied forces to defeat the Nazis who had occupied Italy. I think it was 1943, the actual occupation of Italy, 44. Anyway, so this, the African-American writer, I can't remember his name, an African-American writer wrote a book called Miracle at Santana, which is obviously about the massacre, and then Spike Lee made the movie, as you recalled, which is not a great movie, and honestly, there's some, historical matters that he didn't get quite right. Let's put it this way.
We disagree on the value of the movie, but that's a topic for another day.
Well, it's because he made it. It's his understanding over here about World War II history is a little bit.
That's but continue.
Yeah, it's very Hollywood, So but so that's my connection there. And the other question was, what in the book, right? You said,
yes, sir. If you can just tell us about maybe some tidbits or some interesting things for folk who may want to pick up your book, tell us what they can expect.
Yeah. Well, what they can expect probably is like readings of classic African American books or moment in entertainment, like I have half of one chapter on the relationship on the stage between Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. and Bruce Springsteen and Clarence Clemons. So I would say that mostly what I do is like give what I would call uncommon reading of canonical text, okay, and performances, and then through this try to enlarge the discourse about race, because it seems to me that the focus is too much on color at the expense of color itself. In the sense, I think that the racial discourse need to be enlarged to other factors, like, for example, language, which was mentioned before, right? And then another one would be religion. Okay? Another thing would be, for example, identity in terms like community identity, food, for example. And if you start looking at this thing, then I think that, at least that's what I found. You see how color actually re-enters this scene time and again. Okay? But you have a much wider view of what actually color does within the racial discourse. Mm-hmm. And language is absolutely fundamental to it. Mm-hmm. I mean, two of the previous speakers were talking about language in the novel they were discussing, right? The same is, I think, needs to be need to be studied more when it comes to race relationship in the early 20th century, or for the matter today. Mm-hmm. I mean, today in America we have a very similar situation to early 20th century United States, in the sense that there's a very high number of people whose parents or themselves are foreign born and they speak other languages. In New York City, you have pretty much the same situation that you had in the early 20th century, when you have about 1 out of 3 or 4 kids who are either foreign born or children of foreign born parents. And they don't grow up in a household where English is the first language, right? In the early 20th century, this is exactly the same situation that happens with, Italians, Jews, Slavics, all sorts of people, Chinese. I mean, it's the same story, right? Now, unlike the immigrants, the African Americans at that time, they own the English language. That's why you have Booker T. Washington. That's why you have W. Du Bois. That's why you have the Harlem Renaissance. Okay? They produce a literature that those immigrant groups we won't produce until their children learn the language, which happens for the most part, with few exceptions, in the 1930s, right? Which also happens to be the decade of the Great Depression and the uprising of unions and more in moments of interracial communities being formed, whether fictional or actually real. So that's some of the things that I emphasize there in the book. Mm-hmm. Another one is the role of popular culture in the representation of race and whiteness. Okay? And one of the points I try to make is that, which connects to what I just taught. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we categorize every white person in as white. There's a lot more to it. Okay? Like a Jewish immigrant, an Italian immigrant, a Russian immigrant is not the same as, somebody who came on the Mayflower and was white in 17th century or 18th century or whenever it was. Okay?
You're going to make people mad when you say that, Sam.
Well, I may make the people mad, but it's a fact, And being, of Jewish faith or Catholic is a lot different than being, a Southern Baptist, for example. So, and I'm not saying that, of course, these people are enjoying the privileges of whiteness. There's no question about that. Okay? But it's something that's achieved over time. Because when they come over, they're not considered totally white. That's for sure. That's the case of Italians. Because also, and the Irish, because the Italians immigrants to the country are, for the most part, from southern Italy. Okay? And it's not nothing new. The southern Italians are, dark skin and dark complexion. And in fact, when they arrive in New York, they are classified as white of dark complexion, which is, then later is, the scholarly definition of these people are called in-between people. And actually, late 19th century, early 20th century, they are victim of lynchings very often. There's at least recorded 60 lynchings of Italians throughout the United States, and actually the biggest lynching recorded is the lynching of 11 Italians in New Orleans in 1891, which happens exactly at the time when Jim Crow is established. And the reason why the lynching happened is because the Italians were building an interracial, essentially, powerhouse in New Orleans along the dock in the commerce of citrus and other fruits and vegetables, along with other ethnic groups and African Americans. There's an African American historian who wrote an article about it called, a threat to white superiority. What is it? I can't remember exactly, but he makes the case that the lynching in New Orleans, because is basically as an attempt of white power to reestablish the racial line according to white and black, essentially. So if you go, that's what you find in the book.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know we run a little short of time here, but yeah, you got a lot of great stuff in that book, Sam, and a lot of it was new to me, and I'm sure it's the case with other people as well, about those connections between Italian Americans, African Americans, Italian culture, and African diasporic culture. And we talked about this before when we did our podcast. But when you get ready for part 2, Sam, don't forget me. We can co-author that. We can do in the name of the mother part 2, talking about the 21st century. We talk about Miracle St. Anna, some of the rappers, and some of those kinds of things as well. But I did want to give up opportunity to ask some questions. Tanya, do we have any in the chat yet? Okay, so people may want to just ask some straight.
I do not see any in the chat. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and.
Well, I'm gonna give Ira a chance. Ira, you might have a chance. You may want to ask Sam a question there, or vice versa, while we're waiting for some questions from people in the chat. Ira, do you have any questions for Sam about what he discussed?
I learned a lot. I mean, I guess there's a number of moments of kind of crossover. I mean, I'm thinking about. Maybe one question would be about the man farthest down, Booker T. Washington's work, which I think is a kind of remarkable work, relatively underappreciated.
It is.
And I'd be curious about, your sort of how you feel like that kind of fits within, within the kind of canon of kind of Italian American studies, or ways that it might sort of shine. Be particularly illuminating around some of these kinds of questions in the early 20th century.
Yeah, as succinct as possible.
Well, I mean, I agree entirely. It is a very underrated book, and it's actually, I think the most important thing. Well, the most important. I think one of the most important things about the book, and it gives you an idea of how complex this man was. And I think there's a tendency to reductionism in his. I understand the politics accommodation and so forth, they critique, but if you actually read his correspondence and what he writes in this book, you see a man that has a much larger vision. And not that he's right or wrong. The point is it's not a moral critique, is right or wrong. That's beyond the point. But you see that he has the perception of, a world that is changing, and he realizes that. And he's not, he's still the only one. It's the only preeminent figure that takes the time to go to Europe and doesn't do the grand tour. Doesn't do the grand tour, which he did before, but, it doesn't go there to, go to Rome and Paris and London and meet the aristocracy and the powers to be. He goes there to look at the working class, the proletarians in Europe, who are the immigrants. They're coming to America and are changing, the racial composition of the country. And he writes, this is a book that runs about 500 pages. And he has, at least 150 to 200 pages are about Southern Italians. And it's interesting to me the fact that, he always, when he sees this Italian peasant, he always makes connection to slaves. He pops in his mind this issue of slavery time and again, because of the conditions that he sees and the racial conditions that he sees there. And interestingly enough, he calls the mafia the racial issue of Italy. It's a complicated issue we don't have time to go into, but there's something to be said about that. So, I think it's a text that should be studied way more than it is. I agree with Ira.
Sounds like another book, Sam. Sounds like another book.
Well, I hope that somebody else does. That's one point. One of the goals of my book is that other people write about this stuff.
Right. Exactly.
I want to ask Ira about the CONGO Love Song.
Yeah. Go ahead.
About the issue of language, actually, which obviously I'm interested, because obviously, we're talking about colonialism, and so language plays a huge part in that. You don't have colonialism if you don't have language to do it as well, to an extent. It's not just a matter of military invasion. So I'd like to know how that got into, if he did get into his book or the discourse around what he's studying in that book and how he got there.
And Ira, we're a little bit
Yeah, I mean,
please answer that as succinctly as you can.
sure. I mean, so I have a chapter on the book that looks at the work of an incredibly important and very little known woman named Althea Brown Edmiston, who was an important linguist of the Bouchon language, which is the language of the Kuba. She was educated at Fisk University. There's a new book I want to mention as well by a colleague, historian Kimberly Hill, called A Higher Mission, about the Edmiston family. And so just a few things. I mean, one is what we see there is we see among this Presbyterian mission that I've sort of focused on more particularly, that the linguistic fluency and expertise of Black missionaries far exceeded that of their white colleagues. They were better educated. They were coming, so someone like Edmiston was coming out of Fisk University, where she got a really remarkable education in the 1890s in Latin and Greek, which is the kind of education that Booker T. Washington was publicly mocking, that then became the foundation for the work that she did, which was the best dictionary of Bouchon for generations of scholars, I mean, mainly European scholars of these languages. Well, what these African American missionaries did with their expertise in Bouchon and also in Chaluba was they used this language to translate African American spirituals into Bantu languages. And so we have hymn books, right, of these being published both into Bouchon and into Chaluba, which is now one of the sort of four national languages of the current Congo. So it was really an area where Black missionaries had made a particular intervention, right? And they translated things like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. They're still part of a hymnal that's produced that I, bought a copy of when I was in the, was able to buy 10 years ago when I was in, well, not in Kinshasa, but and so these are the things that we are able to see there. So the language was really important. I mean, the thing about that I want to mention about Edmiston's dictionary as well is she worked on this for basically it took her 30 years to get published, right? Because the Presbyterian, it was a scholarly work, and the Presbyterian Church was not interested in a scholarly dictionary that had analysis of grammar and all of these other things, right? Maybe a sort of, 2-page series of commands about how sort of missionaries might speak to their sort of Congolese servants. But what she was doing was much more sophisticated and scholarly, and she had to, work for 30 years, a lot of it fundraising at HBCUs, to eventually have that book published, which she did publish in the 1930s.
Good stuff. So, Sam, hopefully he mostly answered what you asked.
Oh, yeah.
If not, y'all can communicate. I'll connect y'all both, or you can go to each other's email. Ira, let me ask you what I asked Sam earlier. Are you okay if folk on the call or folk who watch this later on YouTube, can they reach out to you at Texas A&M? I know you're doing your
absolutely
now.
Absolutely, no. There'll be a slight delay, but the Texas A&M email still works fine, and and we'll sort of going forward, and I'm happy to kind of continue these conversations with everyone.
Absolutely. And so we're running a little bit over. I like to be conscious of everybody's time, but man, great. Thank you, Ira. Thank you, Sam. And these topics that you both are discussing are very, I interviewed you both obviously on my podcast, but they were, new to me. And I think to a lot of people, and so hopefully, like you said, Sam, people will pick up that gauntlet and continue, the studies there. Maybe me and you, Sam, that's what it's gonna be. But I'm gonna turn it back over to my wife, Tanya. We'll see if anyone has any questions, and then she'll kind of close us out and tell us about upcoming events. Go ahead, Tanya.
Yeah, I see no further questions in the chat, so I want to thank all of our. Oh, I'm sorry. We do. Okay, we have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I think I have a comment because this is just weighing heavy on my heart, and I know this isn't the oppression Olympics, and also just this proximity to whiteness and the ability for people who immigrate in to be able to assimilate. Assimilation is not good for any of us, including people who can't assimilate into American whiteness. And just to put into the room that lynchings were bad for everyone. And,
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
know, but when you add up the numbers of people who were slaughtered either by lynching or by other means, that there's a big difference, especially since Blacks are still being lynched. In the last year, we've seen lynchings, and I just want to put it out there that there is a difference. And I also acknowledge that all histories need to be written about, but they also need to be contextualized in terms of the impacts on different groups of people. And so I just needed to say that there's a difference, and the invisibility of whiteness is how white supremacy continues to move forward. Because if we keep the narratives around the oppressed, the oppressors become invisible. And so in the story of America, historically, that's what we tend to do. That's the narratives that have been told. And so I appreciate that we are working on changing what those narratives are.
Well said, sister. And keep coming to our Intellect U Well Journeys talks, because we do these 3 times a year, and we try to hit a lot of these issues. So our next one is going
Well,
to
I'm
be
in
on.
California, so once you're off Zoom, I'm not sure I can fly to Houston to to join y'all. So I'm glad I'm able to be here now.
And we'll put them on YouTube as well, and we made live stream. We'll kind of see how we're going. Hold on one second, Terrence. I'll get you in as well. But yeah, our next one's going to be coming up in June. It's going to be about fictional journeys. So we're going to get into fiction a little bit. We don't often delve into fiction, but we do on occasion. And just briefly, Tony, I'm gonna turn it over to you. But Sam, I have to ask you again, if you could hold your book up, did you ever figure out who that young man was on the cover of your book? I know you're trying to
No,
figure out, but he
no,
definitely.
fortunately I wasn't. Can I jump in about what Taninia said? I
Yeah,
mean,
very very quickly. And
yeah,
show your cover too.
she's absolutely correct. What I would add, it's what there's any among white people, there's a tendency they want to assimilate. As she said, assimilation is bad for everyone. What comes with that is the erasure of historical memory, which is how they distance themselves from their origins, and then how they, get into whiteness. And the erasure of historical memory is one of the things that keeps oppression. Because when you go back and look at your own history, you find out that, you were lynched as well. Then you should start thinking about what's happening in today's society. If what happened to today's people isn't the same thing that happened to your people once, because it happened to other people before them. And then, at the point, if you don't get it, no way that, you're right, nothing we can do about it, But the erasure of historical memory is a key factor, in the continued, racial oppression.
So Tania, I hope I.
So I didn't find to go back to the photo. No, I couldn't find it. I was never able. And a friend of mine tried as well because he was fascinated by it. And he's a former editor of publishing houses, so he knows to do stuff way better than I do. But no, I wasn't able to find out. But apparently, it's a famous speech because the editor of the book, the publishing house that I did the book with, said he's a well-known feature of the Library of Congress.
So the young man on the cover of Sam's book looks like he.
Yeah, this one.
There you go. He looks like he's has some African connections there.
Yeah,
which fits right in with his work.
The African influence in Italy is everywhere, especially in southern Italy. Not only, but it's well established.
Sister Tanini, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Did I get it right? close?
Yes,
Yeah,
we did.
good. So hopefully, Sam addressed your question, and you can reach out to him directly, him and Ira as well, and of course Luis and Carl. Y'all could continue the conversation. When we do these book talks, man, I hate to end them because we could be on all day talking about these issues, and they're important issues, and great stuff. That's why I would tell folk you can, reach out to these scholars and talk to them, and also have some of these conversations in your own communities. And also with Sam and with Ira, you go to New Books Network and look up their names. You can see the interviews I did with them. And so we go more in depth individually with their books. And they're a few years old now, 3 or 4 years old. But I interviewed both Ira. That's how we first met, Ira and Sam. New Books Networks, New Books in African American Studies. And you can hear, you can't see, but you can hear my podcast, both of these folks, and you can hear me and Sam talking about our love for North Carolina and good barbecue and all those kinds of things, as I'm originally from North Carolina as well. But before we close out, Tanya, if you can give me a few more, maybe a minute or so, I want to give Terrence a chance because Terrence waited patiently. So I want to give Terrence a chance to say a little something. Terrence, you ready, brother? You can go ahead and get it in.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this made me think about the idea of information or literature and how that translates into positive change versus learning for just the sake of learning or discussion. I was in a meeting yesterday with Dr. Maulana Karinga, and he was talking about this, the whole thing about, African studies, has a purpose. It's just not for learning or literature. It's to change conditions. And he preferenced the Black Power movement, in terms of, how that came about and the literature that was produced from that towards this whole thing of changing our conditions, even the poetry and the poets, with some action behind it. And so I'm saying that also because I think when not doing that is pretty dangerous. Not saying that's what's happening here, but I'm just trying to give some context here that, the danger of just getting into scholarship for the sake of scholarship, if that's what it is particularly when talking about these sort of issues. It carries a responsibility, as opposed to the what you might find in the academic arena.
Sam, Ira, either one of you want to respond or comment to what Brother Terrence said?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the things that it's annoying about academia to me is the complete detachment for public school. I think that academics should go, into, public schools and talk about this stuff. They have some expertise, obviously. And I think, Taninia says she works she teaches elementary school, right? Well, I think we should start, I took one time a colleague of mine, and is a famous scholar, well-known scholar, his name is Werner Soller. He did a lot of ethnic studies in African American scholar. And I invited to and I took him to the International Civil Rights Museum in Greensboro to visit. And we happened to be the only two adults there, along with a class of an elementary school. And what these kids were seeing, and hearing images of people lynched and, segregation and Jim Crow, and the guide, who was a white girl, used the word mutilated with a reference to an African American whose body had been obvious. And one of the students, who was a young African American student, said, "What does mutilated mean?" So, there's a need to teach since the early age, I think, that history, instead of mythicize the history of the United States or any other country. And how do you do that? Because you cannot use the same vocabulary you use with an adult who is a 5-year-old, because obviously there's psychology there, a psychological dimension that is different, right? And so one of the things that academic could do is work with, public school educators in finding ways, to bring their expertise, and they will certainly learn something from elementary or high school or middle school teachers too, that they could use.
And that's one of the reasons why we do these discussions as well, as you know, Sam.
And occasions like this are just precious. And actually, I thank you again for inviting me. But you should, you guys are doing great work. We should have more of organization like yours. But this is where the focus, I think, needs. I think that the only way to change this discourse is by educating people.
Sam, I hate to cut you. I hate to cut you short. We are running a little bit over, but I hope people respect. You can hear the passion in Sam's voice, Brother Terrence, and everybody about these issues here. This is real for him. And again, I know Sam very well, and I can tell you, he doesn't just do this just to be a scholar. He does this because these are real issues for him. And again, you listen to our podcast, you can hear, he talks a little bit more about his family connection to that situation in Santa and those kinds of things. Ira, very briefly, I want to give you a chance to respond.
No, just as a really, really quick point. One of the things you see in this, in the African American response to the assassination of Lumumba, which was literally 60 years ago last month, so this is February 15th, is which you had this protest at the United Nations, right? And it was organized by who? By Maya Angelou, Abby Lincoln, and Rosa Gee, writers, artists. The Cultural Association for Women of African Heritage really want to highlight the importance of women there. But the people who came out were people like Amiri Baraka, Larry Neal, Askia Touré, Aisha Rahman, Dan Watts, Max Roach, all of these really important writers and artists. And in a sense, what you have is you have a movement that became then the foundation for what we kind of understand as the Black arts movement, the sort of cultural wing of the Black Power movement. This wasn't sort of something that was taking place within sort of academic space or even how we kind of understand kind of modern versions of kind of nonprofit organizations, right? This was radical Black political culture that was also engaged in forms of sort of print culture. People, all of these organizations published magazines, books, things like that. Again, this was an incredibly important and kind of dynamic moment and venue that sort of, I think, has a lot of, continues to have a lot of lessons for us today.
Thank you so much, Ira, on that. And we can continue these conversations via chat, offline. You can contact Ira and Sam directly. Tania, I think Tanya's about to tell you something you're going to really like if you don't see it on the screen. This is something for you as an elementary school teacher next month. But I'm gonna be quiet. Let Tanya tell y'all about some of our upcoming activities, and then we're going to be closing out.
Yes, so I'm glad you can see my screen. Our next event is on April 17th, and it is a collaboration with News Literacy Project, and it's going to be a session on media literacy and digital citizenship, and it's specifically for educators. So we're going to have some breakout sessions for educators at the elementary level, middle school, high school. So really talking about history and cultural studies related to media literacy and how those things are taught in schools. And so hopefully you all can join us for that. It will be a virtual session as well on Saturday, April 17th from 9 till noon. So that's our next Intellect U Well event coming up just next month.
And you
James,
all,
is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say it's open to elementary, middle school, high school, college, university. So Ira, Sam, Luis, all of you all who are here can do that. Also, adult education people. So if you work as a coordinator or some kind of program where you're teaching in the community or something like that, it's good for you as well. So please join us. And I know, Tanina, we're going to be talking about some of those issues, particularly Jeff Scher from UCLA is going to be there talking about elementary, how to teach critical media literacy at the elementary age. And just one last thing, we don't have the flyer up for it yet, but in June we're going to be doing another one of these, Intellect U Well Journeys. Like I said, fiction. Make sure that you on Eventbrite that you follow us so you can get information anytime we have new events. We're also on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We're going to be on soon, and we have our webpage, so you can always find our information up there. How's that, Tanya? Was that succinct enough? I know we're over, but is that okay for everybody? We're over, but we were hot. We had some great discussion, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think so.
So thank you everyone for participating. We had some great comments from everyone, and we'll see you at the next event, either coming up next month or we're going to see you in June. All right. Any final comments, Tanya, to close us out? Thank you again, Ira and Sam, for leading our second session. Tanya.
Yeah, no more comments from me. Thank you, everyone, for joining. So happy and pleased that you took some time out of your Sunday afternoon to have this great conversation. So thank you for joining.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody. And one last, Tanina, we'll do the jazz hands one more time for you, for Sam and Ira. All right. Take care, everybody. It's cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.